What's up, guys? Michael Corsentino with my June 2019 lighting tutorial for Shutter Magazine BehindTheShutter.com. This month I'm going to share with you the 10 things I wish I knew before I started using strobe. But I have to tell you, when I started using strobe, I was so confused. I had no idea. There was no YouTube. There were no, learning outlets for, finding out how to use strobe and how to make it all make sense. So we're really lucky right now that we have so many resources. Of course, Shutter Magazine Behind the Shutter being chief among them. So this month we're going to take a deep dive into the 10 things I wish I knew before I started using strobe. Number one, and top of the list, is really what I like to call the 4 principles of light. And these 4 things are what you need to know to crack the code of working with strobe. Okay, so I call it QQDD. It's just my shorthand. The first one being quantity of light. So basically, when people are working with strobe, especially with manual strobe, they don't really know where to start, how much power to use. And that really just goes to the amount of light that you need to properly expose the subject matter. Okay, so that's quantity of light. You either dial it up or dial it down. And when I say it, I mean the power. So it's either more power or less power, more light or less light. It's really that simple. Next one is quality of light. That's our second Q. Quality of light goes to whether you want hard light, very specular light, very contrasty light, or you want soft light, very diffuse light, very open light with soft shadows, soft transitions between highlights and shadow. Hard light has very quick, rapid transitions between highlight and shadow, and I'll show those to you. I have some examples. Next one is direction of light, and that means where you position your light relative to your subject in a circle, an imaginary circle around your subject. So if your light is pointed directly at the subject at your camera position, you're going to have a very flat quality of light. As you move that light around your subject, you are going to introduce more direction, and more direction introduces more shadow. Okay, and the next one is our second D. So we've got QQ. Our first D was direction of light, and our second D is distance of light. The distance that you place your light from your subject is going to impact the quality of the light. Okay, the rule of thumb is basically the closer your light is to your subject, the softer the quality of light will be. And this goes to light modifiers as well, and we're going to talk about that. The further away, the closer it is also, the larger its perceived size in relationship to the subject, okay, the light and the modifier. The further away that you move that light, the harder the quality of light, and the smaller its perceived size in relationship to the subject. All right? So again, QQDD. That's really the simplest way to think about it. Number 2 is understanding how to use strobe in the studio and on location. All right, those are the 2 scenarios that you have. Now, when you're working with strobe in the studio, you have one light source. That's it, just your strobe. When you're working with strobe on location, you're mixing ambient light and strobe together, and you control each of those scenarios differently. When you're working in the studio, it's all about understanding that shutter speed is basically irrelevant in the studio. Okay, you set it at your max sync speed for your camera, generally between 125th of a second and 200th of a second, and you leave it. That's it. You never change it. Okay, because what you're changing in the studio, since you're working with only one source of light, the strobe, what you're changing in the studio is the strobe power and your f-stop. That's it. Okay, so you're setting the f-stop that you want. Typically in the studio, for me, I'm around f11 to f16, sometimes a little more open than that, but that's generally the range, because you don't have distracting backgrounds to worry about, so there's no reason to really shoot wide open unless you're going for kind of an effect. And so your shutter speed is not really playing a role because there is no ambient light to worry about. The sole source of your exposure of your light is the strobe. That's it. Now on location, when you're dealing with ambient and strobe together, then your shutter speed plays a role. Okay, so that's really important. when you're on location, when you're working with ambient and strobe together, your shutter speed is going to control the amount of ambient light that is contributed to the exposure. So what do I mean? What I mean is the slower the shutter speed that you use, the more ambient light is going to be contributed to that exposure. The ambient light is the dominant light source when you're working on location, okay, when you're working in ambient and strobe together. The ambient light is the dominant light source, so you're going to use shutter speed to control that. Lower shutter speed means more ambient light contributed. Faster shutter speed means less ambient light contributed. Okay, so when you want to knock down the ambient light, create a really dramatic sky, you're going to use a fast shutter speed. In many cases, you may need to opt into high-speed sync because you may want something faster than your camera's sync speed. Okay, so that's how you do that. And when you're working with ambient and strobe together, in addition to shutter speed for the ambient light, what's going to control the strobe is going to be strobe power, and to a lesser extent, your aperture. Basically, I don't want to rely on my aperture, okay? So I use strobe power because when you're on location, you want to, just like in the studio, you want to set an aperture that works for your creative choices, you know, how much background information you want to bring in. So typically, I don't rely on my aperture when I'm working on location. I set my ambient exposure using my shutter speed. I turn on my strobe. I've got the aperture dialed in that I want, and then I rely on strobe power, either dialing it up or down, to create the look that I want with my strobe. Okay, it's basically I'm filling in, I'm illuminating the subject, because the subject, if I knock down the light, for example, with a fast shutter speed, is now going to be underexposed. So I need to properly expose that subject. Okay, so again, I don't want to confuse you guys. The situation is this: in the studio, you set your shutter speed at your max sync speed. That's it. You set your aperture at the desired aperture, and then you use strobe power up or down to properly expose. And I would recommend a light meter. I'll talk about light meters later on. With ambient and strobe together, you're going to use your shutter speed to control the ambient light, and you're going to use your flash power to control the amount of flash contributed to the exposure. It's really that simple. Let's take a look at an example here. Okay, so here you can see on the left, we've got a studio image. And again, here I just set my shutter speed at 1/25th of a second. I'm using, I believe, f16 in this image. And then I'm just using a flash meter and getting a reading for the flash that is going to match the aperture that I'm using. I'm metering the flash at f16 so that it matches the f-stop that I'm using, and right away I've got the perfect exposure. When I click the shutter the first time, I'm in the ballpark and I'm ready to rock. Okay, so that's all that I have to worry about is this flash power in the studio. Now on location, as you can see here on the right, I've got two sources of light. I've got the ambient light and I've got the flash that I'm filling in with. So first things first, I set my ambient exposure, okay, and I do that. The flash is off. I just use my shutter speed. I've got the aperture dialed in that I want. Then I turn on the flash, and then I dial it up or down to create the proper amount of fill flash for the desired look. There is no perfect recipe. It's whatever the look is that you want to create, okay? So that's that. Number 3 is that one light rules. It's really easy to think that you need a ton of lights to get started. 2 lights, 3 lights, etc. That if you only have one light, you really can't do a lot of things. That's the furthest thing from the truth, okay? I have a lot of lights, and oftentimes I default just to one light. There's a lot that you can do with one light, whether you're in the studio or on location. Typically on location, I'm 1 to 2 lights. Sometimes I use the sun as a second light, as a backlight. So, you know, you can do a lot of damage with one light. I've pulled up a couple images just to show you a variety of looks that you can create with one light. There's just a ton. I mean, like I say, I shoot a ton with just one light. So don't feel bad if you only have one light. There's a lot that you can do. In fact, one light is really one of the best ways to learn because you're eliminating all the variables. You're not thinking about too many things. It really simplifies it, and you can really see what's going on, what that light, what is contributing, what that one light is doing. So even when I'm working with multiple lights, I'm dialing them in one at a time because I want to see exactly what each of those lights are doing, okay? So if you need a place to start, or you've been thinking about lighting, getting started with lighting, just start with one light. It's really all you need. Number 4 is how to work with multiple lights. So we talked about one light, and I want to show you what you can do when you use multiple lights. Okay, one light is great, but eventually you will graduate to multiple lights, or you will want to, and you'll want to create some more sophisticated effects. All right, so here's an example of, on the left we have one light, and on the right we have, let's see, we have the key light, we have 2 accent lights, and we have the hair light. So that is 4 lights going on, and you can see the difference that adding extra points of light really adds to this image. It creates layering, it creates dimension, it creates a dimension, a sculptural quality, because you're adding different facets of planes of light to the subject's face. So again, when you're working with multiple lights, you have to think about it in terms of multiple zones of light, and each one of them you're going to want to meter them differently so that they contribute different amounts of light. They're not all set at exactly the same power. They're going to be set differently, and that's really where a light meter comes in, because it allows you to understand the relationships in terms of how much power they're delivering, how much light they're delivering, and everything is sort of revolves around the key light. So for example, if my key light is at f16, I want my accent lights typically a stop under, let's say, so f8, and the hair light is going to depend on whether the subject is a brunette or a blonde, and sometimes I dial that in intuitively, sometimes I'll meter it. And again, like I said with one light, when I'm working with multiple lights, what I'm doing is I am dialing them in one at a time. So I start with my key light, I meter that so that it's at the proper exposure based on what aperture I'm using on my camera. I turn it off. I move over to my first accent light. Let's say the accent light coming in on the left-hand side, camera left side of the subject on the image on the right. I'll meter that. And then I turn that off, and then I go over to the next accent light, the one on the camera right side, turn that off, then I'll dial in the hair light, and even if I'm not metering it, that's the only light that I'm exposing for, taking a picture, looking at it, seeing how much, whether the hair is too bright or not bright enough, and then dialing up the power accordingly. Okay, so multiple lights give you a lot more to work with, obviously. And they really allow you to do things like pull the subject off the background or create volume and dimension that you can't really achieve with just one light. Okay, there's a lot that you can do with one light, but there's a lot more that you can do with multiple lights. Number 5, modifiers make all the difference. Lighting really is all about the modifier that you're using, okay? The look that you're able to create is completely dictated by the modifier that you're using, its size, the interior finish of the modifier, whether it's white or silver, the size of the modifier. All of those things play a really, really key role in what your lighting is going to look like, in the quality of the light that I talked about earlier when I talked about QQDD. This is all about quality of light, okay? So I have a couple examples here just to drive the point home. So here you can see what is a very specular, contrasty image of a band that I work with and do their promotional work. I'm using a medium-size umbrella with a silver interior, a Profoto umbrella with an interior. It is a bounce back, okay, so the light is shooting into the umbrella and then bouncing back onto the subjects. It's a silver interior. It's a deep umbrella, one of Profoto's deep umbrellas that they came out with recently, and it is placed fairly far from the band. Okay, and because of that, it creates a really specular light. In addition to the fact that it's got a silver interior, all of those things are creating a very specular, harder quality of light. The distance and the silver interior of the umbrella. Okay, and conversely, here we have a completely opposite look. We have a very soft look. Now here I'm using a really large scrim, and I'm firing strobes, 1 or 2 strobes through it. So it's creating a and it's placed very close. Okay, so because of that, I'm getting a very soft, diffuse look. It's a very large source of light placed very close. Okay, so remember I said the rule of thumb is the further away the light and the smaller, the the smaller the perceived source size, rather, the smaller the perceived size in relationship to the subject, the harder the light. So for example, if you use a really small reflector, silver reflector, and you place it 8 feet away, you're going to get a very hard specular quality of light. If you use a very large source of light, in this case the scrim that we're using, this is like an 8x8 scrim for this with a strobe fired through it, placed very close to the subjects, you're going to get a very soft quality of light. So people often ask me, what's the perfect modifier to use on location, or what's the perfect modifier to use in the studio? And there is no perfect modifier to use. The perfect modifier is the one that is right for the look that you want to create. Okay, so in this case I wanted to create a very soft, open, airy, kind of romantic look. So I used the largest tool that I had in my arsenal, which was an 8x8 scrim, and I fired a strobe through it. A softbox, even if it was a 4x4 softbox, would have been not quite as soft as this. So the larger the light source, the closer it is, the softer the quality of light. Okay, modifiers, the way that you modify your light, it makes all the difference in what the quality of light will be. Number 6 is flat light versus directional light. This one is really, really awesome. Okay, when I started out, I didn't know the first thing about directional light. Like a lot of people, I think I started out with what I now refer to as yearbook lighting, which is basically set up a strobe on the left, set up a strobe on the right, and fire away at the same power, and you get a very flat, even light. I guess that's fine for some things, but in my humble estimation, it's kind of boring looking. There is a time and a place for flat lighting versus directional lighting, and I'll show those to you. But even that is done differently than today. I do it differently now than I did back in the day, back when I didn't know what I was doing. Okay, so on the left you see flat light. Now this is a beauty light look, where the light is placed above the camera position at a 45-degree angle, more or less. And then there's a reflector placed underneath, or another light placed underneath to create kind of a clamshell lighting arrangement. You can do it with either a reflector or a second light, and you get a very beautiful lighting that is known as paramount or clamshell. Very shadowless light, very flat light, but very beautiful light. Okay, as long as you see, the thing is, there is no right or wrong. What you need to figure out is the look that you want and how to create it. And once you know all of these things, then the world is really your oyster. Then you can really plug these things in where you need them. But that's what I like to teach people, is really how to, they say teach a man to fish, rather than just catch a fish for them. I want to teach you how to think about lighting, and so then you can make informed decisions about what you're doing, rather than just set up a light and start firing away, which is what I did. That's flat light on the left, and it's very beautiful. But also beautiful is directional light. Now on the right you can see here that there's a lot more shadow, and that is because the light has direction in relationship to the subject. The light, this is what we would call short lighting, because the side of the face facing the camera is in shadow. Okay, broad light would be the opposite. Broad light would be if I placed my strobe on camera right side of the subject and lit up that side of the face. But in this case it's short lighting. Anytime that you have a light off axis to your subject, in this case off to the camera left side, it's going to create shadow on the opposite side, and that is directional light. You're giving your light direction, and direction introduces shadow, which introduces shape and volume and dimension, and I would argue creates a much more interesting looking image, a much more editorial looking image. And a look that I really love. And you can modulate that by filling in using reflectors, fill cards, and V-flats and things like that on the shadowed side of the subject. Okay, so flat light versus directional light. When you have your light directly at the camera position, you're going to have a very flat light. When you introduce any kind of direction to that light, you're going to introduce shadow. Simple as that. Number 7 is understanding the difference between soft light and hard light, and how to create both. So here you can see on the left, you can see a very soft image compared to the image on the right, which is a very hard light kind of image. So first we need to define soft light and hard light. Okay, and we talked about this in modifiers. This really goes to the modifiers that you're using. Each one of these is using a very different set of modifiers in order to create a soft look or a hard look. Okay, so for soft light, what we mean when we say soft light is the gradual transition between shadows and highlights. Okay, and as I said before, when we were talking about modifiers, typically to create this, you're going to use a very large source. In this case, on the left, I was using around a 6-foot octabank placed just outside the camera frame. Okay, and that is going to create a very soft look, very gradual transitions between highlight and shadow. Now, conversely, on the right, I'm using a very small, in comparison, a very small beauty dish with a silver interior placed above the camera position and some kicker lights placed on either side, left and right, of the subject, okay, with silver interior. And those are giving, and that is giving me, and it's placed fairly far away. All of those are placed fairly far from the subject compared to the image on the left. And that is creating a very hard light look, okay? So, none of these are wrong, none of these are right. It's all whatever works for the particular subject that you're shooting, the look that you're going for. And once you know how to create those looks, you can plug them in where you want. Okay, so again, soft light on the left, hard light on the right. And we've talked about the tools that you need to get there. Number 8, knowing when not to strobe. This is just as important as knowing when to use your strobe. Knowing when not to use your strobe is really important, okay? Once you start to wrap your head around how to use strobe, it's really exciting. And you end up wanting to, or at least I ended up wanting to use it on everything. And there would be times when I would come back and I would look at the images and I would say, why did I use strobe? I didn't need to use strobe. So it's really important to be able to step back and assess what you have going on with the lighting, more so on location. And oftentimes you'll have exactly what you want. The whole point of using strobe is not just to illuminate. It's to create the quality of light that you want when the quality of light that you want does not exist in the ambient light. When Mother Nature is not giving you the look that you're going for, that's when you use strobe. When you can create the look that you want with what you have already, then there really is no point to using strobe. So I pulled up a perfect example of this. This is an image that I made on location using a bunch of scrims, forming a tent, a light tent essentially. It's a product by California Sunbounce called The Cage, I believe. And it creates a beautiful wrap of light. A large scrim would do that's essentially what this is, a large scrim with a background, and it's got a scrim on top as well. But the point that I'm making is I would not be able to create this kind of wrap, this beautiful quality of light, this super, super soft, diffuse quality of light as well with a strobe. So it's really important to think about what you're trying to create, assess what you have to work with without strobe, and then make a decision. Maybe you need strobe, but maybe you don't. Number 9, more people equal better images. This is especially true when you're working with lighting, but on any shoot, having a team of people, a creative team, hair and makeup, stylist, assistants, all contributes to an overall better end product than when you try to be a one-man band and do everything alone. Now, I know a lot of people want to do everything themselves. I understand that. I get that. But I would advise you to find a way around that. Get some assistance, get people to help you, whether it's your spouse or your son or daughter or the subject's friends or family or interns, whatever you need to do. I guarantee you that if you have more people to add to the overall picture, if you have someone who's worried about the hair and makeup, if you have someone who's handling the styling, if you have someone who's holding your lights for you, if you have someone maybe even grabbing meter readings for you, all of those things allow you to really focus on what you're good at doing, which is making images, rather than trying to do everything yourself. All right, I always work with a team, and because of that, my images are better than they would be without. They really are. And I have to cop to that and say, you know what, it's okay. I want people who are better at what I do, better at doing what they do than what I could do by myself. I'm perfectly okay with that. So here's an example of a location shoot where I had someone scout this location. They found a killer location. I had someone handling styling and hair and makeup. I had a lighting assistant, someone to help me with the lights and help me lug gear and, hold the light when I needed them to hold the light. All of those sorts of things contribute to an overall much better end result than if I just tried to do this all by myself. Number 10, why you need a flash meter. All right, so I've covered this previously in previous tutorials and articles, so I encourage you to go and look them up, but I'll go over this briefly, okay? Your camera, the built-in meter rather, in your camera cannot meter flash, okay? Because the mirror goes up and down when you're taking an exposure, and flash pops for a second and it's too fast for the mirror. You can't use your camera's meter to meter flash. So you end up just chimping and chimping and chimping and taking exposures and checking and dialing up and down the power. That's really not an efficient way to work, an ideal way to work. Moreover, your camera's meter takes what are called reflective readings. It reads the light that is reflected off of your subject. Now, if your subject is wearing black and the subject next to them is wearing white, your camera's meter will be confused. It won't know exactly what to do. So a flash meter is a handheld meter. You dial in exactly the same settings that you have on your camera. Here, I'll show you the one that I use. This is a Sekonic L858. It's a wireless transmitter. It triggers the lights for me. It can control the power. Basically what you do is you dial in exactly the same settings that you have on your camera, the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, and then you meter the lights to match those settings. Okay, so for example, if you had f8 as in this image on your was set on your aperture, you want the flash to meter f8. The amount of power, the amount of light coming out of that flash needs to read f8, so you'll have a proper exposure. All right, so what a flash meter allows you to do is to dial in the amount of light that you want, and then by the time you take a couple readings, to get it right, but then by the time you make that first exposure, it's a perfect exposure, or it's very close. And then it's up to you to kind of season to taste and dial it in. But it gets you right where you need to be. It's a perfect exposure. It may not be creatively what you want, but it is a perfect exposure. Right? A flash meter will also allow you to determine the relationships between strobes. Like when we were talking about multiple lights, I would first meter the key light, let's say it was f16, then I can use this meter to determine whether I want the accent lights one stop under or one stop over the key light. It determines the ratio, and I say ratio, and that's a kind of a scary math word, but basically the meter just shows you -1 or +1. So, one stop under or one stop over. It allows you to do all sorts of really cool things. Let's say you want to meter a background. There's no real way to meter a background and make sure that you have an even light all the way around without a light meter. You end up just having to do a lot of guesswork. That takes time, it's inefficient, not what I would recommend. Okay? A flash meter allows you to work efficiently, consistently, and with repeatable results. Okay? A really, really valuable tool. When I talked about the camera's built-in meter taking reflective readings, I wanted to tell you that what makes a flash meter different is that it will also allow you to take incident readings. So the camera's built-in meter takes a reflective reading the light that is reflecting off of the subjects. And as I mentioned, what that can cause is confusion for the meter, because if you have different colored backgrounds, white and black, right next to each other, the camera's built-in meter doesn't know how to read that properly, and it can cause overexposure or underexposure. With an incident reading, which is what a flash meter takes, or any meter, but a flash meter in this instance, takes a reading of incident reading, which is the light falling on the subject. So it is never tricked up, okay? It is never fooled. It is always consistent, okay? Now we have the complete picture when it comes to flash meters. And there's a bonus round. How to use V-flats. V-flats, I would have to say, are one of the least expensive yet most useful lighting tools that you have in your toolkit. And I wish someone had explained that to me when I started using strobes. So next month, we're going to take a deep dive into all things V-flat. So come on back and check it out then. Until next time, this has been Michael Corsentino for Behind the Shutter at Shutter Magazine.